Jesus says to the disciples today, you give them something. The disciples find themselves on the wrong side of the lake, and darkness begins to set in along with that large crowd who had followed them there. The disciples were beginning to feel responsible to feed all of them. So they turn to Jesus and they ask him to disperse the crowd. But Jesus says, you can share in the solution for this issue. Jesus doesn't take the responsibility away from the disciples' dilemma, but nor does he abandon them. Like in that first miracle at the wedding of Cana in Galilee when they run out of wine. And Jesus' mother turns to him saying, son, go fix this. And Jesus' initial response is to ask her, woman, what does that have to do with me? Last week, I received a text followed by a phone call from an excited grandmother with the news of an engagement. And this grandmother is the mother of my best friend who was killed on the last day of my junior year in high school. Some of you have heard the story, but the future bride was his unborn child, born in our senior year. And hearing this news last week, my heart went back to 27 years ago. I went back to that moment in my young life when hearing the devastating news of someone that I cared deeply for had died. It's in such numbing life moments we think of what we're capable of and yet seek a desired balance of what others can share in the workplace before us. It's this balance in giving. Scholar N.T. Wright challenges us to think of a time of great loss when we were really, really devastated. He says, what you needed and wanted most was to hide away and be quiet. Now, Jesus is told right before our story begins today that his cousin, his colleague, his friend in John the Baptist has been killed. Jesus goes to that quiet side of the lake for solitude. Yet this crowd of thousands follow him there. When he sees them, he has compassion and begins to heal them despite dealing with his own grief. The crowds likely do not know that Jesus is suffering, but his disciples would. Jesus models for the disciples self-care. For the work that they are engaged in with this crowd needs to be divided up so that they can conquer the task together while caring for oneself. Thus Jesus says to them, you give them something to eat. It is time to grow up. A grow-up moment for me was reflecting back on my favorite childhood book, In the Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. A tree that gives and gives and gives to a boy. The tree gives until it has nothing left to give, and the boy, who even as an adult continues to take and take and take. My heart was broken when, as an adult, in learning about healthy practices of self-care and boundaries, that I realized this book's message did not model a relationship of balanced giving. Likewise, Jesus ultimately aids when that wine shortage happens at the wedding. He assists today in the feeding of the 5,000. He doesn't walk away from the work, but he does ask them to give too. From the very beginning, when God gave Adam and Eve the entire garden and told them, "This is all yours except for that one tree," they still wanted that one tree. They wanted it all. God has sought out balanced partners since the beginning of time. Those who can share in the work that they're called to do, which ultimately shows a respecting love to God and to neighbor. It's a partnership that means we take on challenges with a shared responsibility. And when there are times like death or divorce or the loss of a job, that we should carry more of the load to show our love for someone amongst us who's suffering. This is a way to model grace. God has certainly shared grace, not so that we can keep taking and taking, but the opposite, so that we can learn to share in our life. For we all know that we live in a world that promotes taking, and no one gave up more of himself than Jesus did, so that the disciples then, and hopefully the disciples now, can continue to experience the power of a grace-filled life, a life of balancing self and the work before us. In our gospel today, Jesus says to his partners and the disciples, "You give them something." And after they go and do some legwork, the disciples bring Jesus the food they find, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus blesses the food. It miraculously multiplies, showing God is pleased. And then Jesus gives the blessed food back to them, tells them to distribute it to the crowd, and then to put the leftovers into baskets. It's similar to my house and maybe yours, where the person who does the cooking, thus blessing the food, is grateful for the others to set the table, clear the table, put the leftovers in containers at the end, and maybe, and hopefully, doing the dishes. I'm getting really good at these table tasks, and certainly am blessed with the food. Today, we should ache for Jesus following the death of John, especially because Jesus does not get the time to mourn, but that he shows his comfort and his confidence in the growing partnership of the disciples when he asks them firmly to take on and to share in this work. And for us, as followers of Jesus, we're called to be better partners to others, to move away from a mentality of takers, but to move to a way of grace, sharing in the work and simultaneously asking others to help too. The piece in our gospel today, when the disciples pathetically respond, "We have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish." Yet with God's grace working in us, there is never too little. It is a miracle whenever partners can solve and serve God and therefore serve each other. It is a miracle whenever we can move away from being just takers or givers, but to a grace-filled, balanced life where we share as workers in this world. Amen.